Silent hunters of the deep, the submarine campaigns of World War II. In the pitch-black depths of the Atlantic, 48 men held their breath as depth charges exploded around their steel coffin. The year was 1942, and this scene would play out thousands of times as submarines became the most lethal hunters of World War II. They were the silent assassins of the sea, stealing up on merchant convoys like wolves in the night, sending millions of tons of shipping to the ocean floor, and reshaping the very nature of naval warfare. The submarine campaigns of World War II would prove more devastating than all the legendary dreadnoughts and aircraft carriers combined, fought by men who lived in conditions so cramped they could barely turn around, breathing recycled air that reeked of diesel fuel, sweat, and fear. These were the warriors who fought in what Churchill called the only thing that ever frightened me during the war. From the devastating U-boat assault on America's eastern seaboard to the ruthlessly effective American submarine campaign that strangled Japan's economy, 5 submarine campaigns would change the course of World War II. This is their story, a tale of technological innovation, strategic genius, incredible bravery, and at times, stunning hubris. It's a story of men who fought in steel tubes beneath the waves, where a single mistake meant death by drowning, and victory was measured not in territory gained, but in the countless ships that never made it to port. Operation Drumbeat, Germany's U-boats strike America. On January 12, 1942, the freighter SS Norness exploded off Long Island's coast, its burning oil painting the night sky orange. Standing on his U-boat's conning tower, German commander Reinhard Hardigan allowed himself a thin smile. The Americans had made it almost too easy. Their coastal cities still blazed with light, merchant ships sailed alone and unprotected, and radio operators chattered endlessly in clear channels. Hardigan and his fellow U-boat commanders could hardly believe their luck. They called it the second happy time, but for the American eastern seaboard, it would become 6 months of maritime slaughter. Admiral Karl Dönitz had planned Operation Drumbeat meticulously. While Hitler obsessed over the Russian front, Dönitz saw America's entry into the war as an opportunity. He knew the US Navy had deployed most of its anti-submarine vessels to the Pacific after Pearl Harbor. More crucially, he understood American pride would prevent them from adopting the British convoy system quickly enough. For 6 months, he wrote in his war diary, they will pay dearly for their unpreparedness. He was right. 5 Type X U-boats, that's all Dönitz initially sent across the Atlantic. 5 submarines against the mightiest industrial nation on Earth. By June, these 5 boats and their reinforcements had sunk 397 ships totaling over 2 million tons. U-123, under Hardigan's command, prowled within sight of New York City, sinking tankers as Broadway's lights illuminated the night sky. Boston, Philadelphia, and Miami became hunting grounds. Sailors burned to death in blazing oil slicks while summer vacationers watched from beach blankets. Tourism actually increased as Americans drove to coastal hotels, hoping to glimpse the drama of war firsthand. The scale of American unpreparedness defied belief. Despite British warnings, coastal blackouts weren't imposed until months into the campaign. Merchant captains broadcasted their positions freely. When the US military finally responded, they deployed aircraft to hunt U-boats, but forgot to arm them with bombs. Merchant ships' radio operators often refused to maintain silence, arguing with naval authorities that they had the right to communicate with their companies. The human cost was staggering. One U-boat commander described watching through his periscope as a torpedoed Liberty ship's crew abandoned their burning vessel, only to realize their lifeboats had been painted shut by overzealous shipyard workers. But the psychological impact cut deeper than the physical losses. Americans had thought themselves invulnerable behind their oceans. Now German submarines were quite literally surfacing in sight of their beaches, proving that isolation was an illusion. The turning point came not through military might, but through grudging acceptance of British expertise. By July, the US Navy swallowed its pride and implemented mandatory convoys, blackouts, and reformed communications protocols. They learned, as one admiral put it, that this was not a sporting contest, but a war. The second happy time drew to a close, but its lessons would reshape American naval doctrine forever. As for Hardigan and his fellow commanders, most would not survive the war. But in those 6 months of 1942, they had demonstrated how a handful of submarines, properly employed, could bring a superpower's maritime commerce to its knees. The Silent Service, US Submarine War against Japan. Dick O'Kane peered through the periscope of USS Tang, watching the massive Japanese convoy spread across the moonlit Pacific. His hands were steady on the brass controls, but his heart raced. 23 merchant ships, their decks piled high with raw materials bound for Japan's war machine. 4 destroyers circled them like sheepdogs. O'Kane had a decision to make: surface at night for a high-speed attack, or stalk them submerged until dawn. He chose boldness over caution. By sunrise, 7 ships would lie on the ocean floor. The US submarine campaign against Japan stands as history's most successful maritime guerrilla war. American submariners attacked with a ruthlessness that would have shocked their pre-war selves. The transformation began with humiliation. In early 1942, US torpedoes were proving criminally defective, running too deep or failing to explode. Submarine commanders radioed increasingly desperate reports. Perfect attacks wasted, while their boats endured depth charging for nothing. The Navy's Bureau of Ordnance insisted nothing was wrong. It took submariners filming their torpedoes bouncing harmlessly off target ships to force changes. What followed was hunting on an industrial scale. American submarines prowled shipping lanes like mechanized orcas, armed with reliable torpedoes and advanced radar. Japan's merchant marine never stood a chance. Each ship sunk represented another factory starved of steel, another assembly line deprived of rubber, another power plant without oil. Eugene Fluckey's USS Barb even staged the only ground attack on Japan's home islands, sending sailors ashore to blow up a coastal railroad. The numbers tell one story: 1,178 Japanese merchant ships sunk. But in the cramped wardrooms of American submarines, another tale unfolded. The war turned teenagers into killers, teachers into tacticians, and accountants into daredevils. They developed their own culture and superstitions. No one whistled aboard submarines. The word depth charge was taboo. They called them ash cans instead. Some captains forbade crews from washing clothes mid-patrol, believing it invited attacks. Others refused to sail without their lucky rubber chicken or plastic pig. The Japanese response proved fatally flawed. Their destroyers focused on protecting battleships rather than merchants. Anti-submarine warfare remained an afterthought. Most critically, they never developed an effective convoy system. As one Japanese captain wrote after the war, "We valued the warrior's sword over the merchant's abacus. In the end, we needed the abacus more." By 1945, American submarines were finding fewer targets, not because of Japanese defenses, but because Japan had virtually no ships left to sink. The cost had been brutal on both sides. The US submarine service suffered the highest casualty rate of any American military branch, losing 1 in 5 boats. But they had achieved what seemed impossible in 1941. They had strangled an island empire from beneath the waves. At war's end, Admiral Lockwood, commander of the Pacific Submarine Force, received a classified report detailing Japan's wartime oil reserves. Reading it, he wept. When the last B-29S bombed Japan's cities, the nation had only 2 weeks of oil remaining. The submarine campaign had brought Japan to its knees before the atomic bombs were ever dropped. It was perhaps the most decisive campaign that the public never fully grasped, exactly as the Silent Service would have wanted it. The Mediterranean Submarine Warfare: Challenges and Innovations. Lieutenant Commander Malcolm David Wanklyn stood on HMS Upholder's Bridge as Malta disappeared into the darkness behind him. The Mediterranean stars blazed overhead, the same stars that had guided Phoenician traders 2,000 years before. But Wanklyn wasn't thinking about history. He was hunting the largest Italian convoy yet to sail from Naples to North Africa, carrying the tanks and fuel Rommel desperately needed for his Africa Corps. The Mediterranean submarine war was unlike any other. The water's crystal clarity meant submarines could be spotted at depths that would have kept them safe in the Atlantic. The shallow seafloor left no room for deep diving to escape depth charges. And the bright southern sun made periscope attacks suicidal during daylight hours. Yet these same conditions created opportunities found nowhere else. Submarines could lie on the bottom during day, listening for propeller sounds through the excellent acoustic conditions, then surface at night to strike with near impunity. Italian frogmen turned the tables by pioneering human torpedoes launched from submarines. These two-man teams rode modified torpedoes to their targets, attached explosive charges to anchored ships, then escaped on underwater scooters. The British base at Alexandria learned their effectiveness the hard way when Italian frogmen crippled 2 battleships in a single night. The raiders escaped, but their success came with a price. Most would die from the physiological effects of repeated deep dives in cold water. The struggle for Malta became the campaign's epicenter. The tiny British island base threatened every Axis supply route to North Africa. German and Italian submarines worked to strangle it while British boats fought to keep it alive. The island's submariners became legends, drinking warm beer in blast-damaged pubs between patrols, then sailing out to face the combined might of 2 Axis navies. They developed an almost fatalistic bravado. One captain routinely surfaced his submarine beside merchant ships at night, using his deck gun to save torpedoes for more worthy targets. But the Mediterranean's true impact emerged in the tactics it spawned. The confined space forced innovations that would reshape submarine warfare. The Germans perfected coordinated wolfpack attacks. The British mastered the art of submarine-to-submarine refueling. The Italians pioneered midget submarines and covert operations. Each adversary learned from the others, creating a deadly laboratory of underwater combat. By 1943, the tide had turned. Allied codebreakers were tracking every Axis convoy. New radar allowed nighttime surface attacks with unprecedented accuracy. The hunters had become the hunted German and Italian submarines found themselves stalked by aircraft guided by ultra-intelligence straight to their patrol zones. The Mediterranean's clarity, once their greatest challenge, now meant Allied planes could spot them even when submerged. The final battles held a savage irony. The same Italian and German submariners who had once terrorized Allied shipping now found themselves making desperate supply runs to isolated Axis garrisons. The roles had reversed completely. The submarine fleet that had once tried to strangle Malta ended up trying to prevent the strangulation of their own forces in Tunisia. Wanklyn never saw the victory. HMS Upholder disappeared with all hands in 1942, likely sunk by an Italian torpedo boat. But he and his fellow submariners had proved that control of the ancient sea lanes still decided empire's fates, just as it had in Caesar's time. The only difference was that now, the decisive battles happened far beneath those azure waters, in a dark realm the ancient powers never imagined existed. The War of Attrition, Battle of the Atlantic. Otto Kretschmer's U-99 stalked through the night, the phosphorescent wake of 60 merchant ships illuminating the horizon like a highway of stars. Convoy HX-79 thought darkness was their shield. Instead, it made them targets. Kretschmer, nicknamed Silent Otto by his crew, had invented a tactic that would revolutionize submarine warfare: submerged night attacks from inside the convoy itself. By the time dawn broke on October 20th, 1940, 12 ships lay on the ocean floor. This was no longer just commerce raiding, it was industrialized warfare on a scale never before seen at sea. The numbers staggered the imagination. 400 German U-boats against over 3,000 Allied merchant ships, dueling month after month across 3 million square miles of ocean. The Germans had a simple strategy: sink ships faster than Britain could build them. If they succeeded, the British Isles would starve. The Allies had an equally simple counter: keep enough ships afloat to maintain a lifeline to America. Everything else, the campaigns in Europe, the bombing raids, the eventual invasion, hinged on this mathematical equation written in blood and steel. Innovation came at a dizzying pace. The British developed ASDIC, sonar, so U-boats attacked at night on the surface. The Allies deployed radar, so the Germans created radar detectors. Scientists designed better depth charges, so submariners found ways to run silent at unprecedented depths. Each technological leap bought a few weeks' advantage before the enemy countered it. A British mathematician said it best: "The Atlantic War isn't a battle of ships or men anymore. It's a battle of frequencies and wavelengths." May 1943 marked the turning point. 41 U-boats were sunk in a single month, Black May, to the Germans. The tide turned not through any single breakthrough, but through the grinding efficiency of Allied production and organization. Better escorts, longer-range aircraft, more precise depth charges, improved radar, and above all, the breaking of the German naval codes. The hunters found themselves hunted by an invisible web of technology and intelligence. The human cost defied comprehension. 1 in every 4 merchant sailors who left harbor never returned. U-boat crews suffered even worse. 7 out of 8 German submariners never saw home again. The survivors carried scars no one else could understand. Allied sailors reported the worst sound wasn't depth charges or torpedoes, it was the singing. German U-boat crews, facing near-certain death, would often sing into the hydrophones as their boats sank, a final act of defiance picked up by sonar operators above. The legacy lived on in unexpected ways. The Battle of the Atlantic created modern anti-submarine warfare. It birthed operations research, the scientific study of military effectiveness. Most crucially, it proved that wars could be won not through dramatic battles, but through the patient application of technology, intelligence, and logistics. The climactic showdowns of past naval wars had been replaced by something far more modern: a war of mathematics and attrition, fought with slide rules and statistics, as much as torpedoes and depth charges. When Germany surrendered in 1945, 40 U-boats still at sea received the final coded message: "The war is over. Good luck and return to port." Some scuttled their boats instead. The captains claimed it was to deny their technology to the Allies. But some sailors whispered a different reason. After years in the Atlantic's killing grounds, they couldn't bear to sail home to a world that would never understand what they had experienced in the war beneath the waves. Japan's submarine fleet. a technological triumph and strategic failure. Commander Zenji Arita watched through his periscope as the huge American aircraft carrier sailed past his I-19 submarine. His boat carried the finest torpedoes in the world, the Type 95, with a warhead twice the size of German or American models. The carrier was perfectly silhouetted against the sunset. But Arita's orders were explicit. Ignore carriers, ignore merchants. Hunt battleships only. With quiet frustration, he lowered the periscope and let the target slip away. It was September 1942, and Japan was systematically squandering the most technologically advanced submarine fleet on Earth. Japan's submersible fleet represented a paradox. Brilliant engineering crippled by archaic thinking. Their submarines were masterpieces of naval architecture. The I-400 class were underwater aircraft carriers, capable of launching 3 bombers from watertight hangars. The Type A midget submarines could penetrate the most heavily defended harbors. Their torpedoes outranged and outperformed anything the Allies had. Yet these remarkable vessels spent most of the war either anchored in port or pursuing fruitless missions dictated by samurai tradition rather than strategic necessity. The Imperial Navy's submarine doctrine emerged from an obsession with the decisive battle concept. Submarines existed solely to scout for the surface fleet and whittle down American battleships before the grand confrontation that would decide the war. The idea of attacking merchant shipping was dismissed as dishonorable. "A samurai does not strike at the peasants' rice carts," one admiral famously declared. This blindness to economic warfare proved catastrophic. While American submarines strangled Japan's commerce, Japanese boats prowled empty seas hunting for battleships that rarely appeared. The few times Japanese commanders ignored doctrine, the results were spectacular. In 1942, a single submarine raid into Australian waters sank more tonnage than the entire fleet would claim in the next year of hunting capital ships. The I-400S could have devastated the Panama Canal or America's West Coast ports. Instead, they launched a single failed attack on a small Alaskan base. One submarine commander's unauthorized 2-week merchant hunting cruise in the Indian Ocean destroyed more shipping than his entire squadron had sunk in the previous 6 months. The breaking point came in 1944. American codebreakers had cracked Japan's naval ciphers, and submarines became death traps. Yet rather than adapt, the Imperial Navy doubled down on tradition. They converted their remaining submarines into underwater supply ships, sending them on one-way missions to resupply cut-off garrisons. The finest submarine fleet in the Pacific died ingloriously, delivering rice and ammunition to doomed islands. The final act bordered on the surreal. As Japan's cities burned and its people starved, the Navy launched Operation PX, a plan to attack American cities with submarine-launched aircraft carrying plague-infected rats. The war ended before this desperate scheme could be attempted. The surviving submarines were scuttled or surrendered. American engineers who examined them were stunned by their advanced technology. One wrote, "They had the tools to strangle our supply lines and change the course of the war. Thank God they never realized it." The tragedy of Japan's submarine fleet wasn't their defeat, it was their waste. They possessed every advantage: superior torpedoes, excellent crews, advanced boats, and perfect targets. What they lacked was strategic vision. Their failure stemmed not from any fault of technology or crews, but from leaders who remained anchored in the age of sail while fighting a modern war. In the end, the world's finest submarine fleet was defeated not by their enemies, but by their own refusal to adapt to the changed nature of naval warfare. Legacy of the Silent Submarine Service. On September 2, 1945, Commander Hank Murphy stood on the deck of USS Dentuda as Tokyo Bay filled with Allied ships for Japan's surrender. His submarine's combat patrol report told a stark story. 11 merchant ships sunk, 4 damaged, and 67 sailors lost to the dark waters of the Pacific. But it was the last entry that haunted him. Picked up 3 survivors from torpedo transport. 1 died aboard. They had been floating for 6 days. No other survivors found, Murphy would later write in his memoir. In that moment, watching the surrender, I realized submarine warfare had changed not just the way we fight wars, but the very nature of naval power itself. The submarine campaigns of World War II marked the end of centuries of naval orthodoxy. Gone were the days when battleships ruled the waves and decisive fleet engagements determined the fate of nations. A new era had dawned, one where invisible predators could strangle a nation's economy from beneath the waves, where cargo tonnage mattered more than battleship guns, and where the difference between victory and defeat was measured not in territory gained, but in supplies delivered. The age of Mahan's great fleet battles had given way to something far more subtle and deadly. Modern navies absorbed these lessons at great cost. Aircraft carriers might have grabbed headlines, but submarines reshaped naval strategy. Every advancement in submarine technology sparked a counter-innovation in detection and defense. The nuclear age only amplified this. Dynamic ballistic missile submarines became the ultimate deterrent, capable of ensuring a nation's survival even if its homeland was destroyed. A young American officer who served on diesel boats in 1945 would end his career commanding nuclear submarines that could circle the globe without surfacing, carrying more firepower than all the bombs dropped in World War II combined. But perhaps the most profound legacy was psychological. Submarine warfare demonstrated that modern conflicts would be won not through glorious charges or decisive battles, but through the patient application of economic pressure and technological superiority. The admirals who once dreamed of grand fleet reviews and broadside duels were replaced by technicians monitoring sonar displays and analysts studying shipping routes. The romantic age of naval warfare had ended in the cold depths of the Atlantic and Pacific. Today's submarine commanders patrol the same waters their predecessors did, though with technologies those pioneers could hardly have imagined. But they still study the lessons learned in World War II's submarine campaigns. They know that beneath the waves, pride still kills faster than enemy action. That technological advantage means nothing without sound doctrine. That the most decisive victories often come not from destroying enemy fleets, but from simply making the seas too dangerous to use. As for the submarines themselves, most rest in the deep graves where they fought. U-boats litter the Atlantic floor. Japanese boats rust in the Pacific depths. British, German, and Italian submarines still guard the Mediterranean's ancient secrets. But their influence sails on in every modern submarine, in every naval strategy session, and in the unspoken understanding that the next great naval war might be fought without ships ever seeing each other at all. The silent hunters of World War II changed more than the war. They changed warfare itself. And in doing so, they left us with a sobering reminder. In modern conflict, the most decisive weapons are often the ones you never see coming.